What's going on, everybody? I hope everyone is having a fantastic night. We are back. The Scoop on the U. This time we're breaking down the matchup against the Texas A&M Aggies with a very special guest. Ross, why don't you introduce our guest to the fans watching right now?
We have got with us the editing manager over at SB Nation. I believe, what is their site they have over there called?
It's Robert Behrens, the man of the hour. How you doing, Robert?
So, the site is Good Bull Hunting.
Good bull hunting. All right. I was going to say something. I was going to say those three words, and I was going to say them in the wrong order. So I'm glad that you clarified that. Thank you, Robert.
Robert, man, greatly appreciate just you taking the time to speak with us and break down the matchup. Look, a lot of Canes fans are really excited about the matchup against Texas A&M. I'm seeing a lot of Texas A&M fans kind of viewing it as a big game as well. I think it's going to really give a good preview of everyone, football program, where things stand so early in the season before getting into conference play.
Absolutely, man. I think there's a lot of similarities between where A&M fans are right now and where Miami fans are, because both of us obviously endured a 5-7 season last year. Both teams with a lot of reasons why we think this year could be a big step forward. And like you said, this is kind of that big first step because we both had that first game where it was a pretty dominant win. There's always positives you can take away, but you always sit there and say, okay, but is that just because you're playing New Mexico? Is that just because you're playing Miami of Ohio? And so this is one of the games that I know we've had circled on our calendar all offseason because you feel like this is that like real first measuring stick of, okay, like we think we're going to be better. We think Miami is going to be better, but who's actually going to go out in the field and prove it? Because whichever team walks out of this 2-0, I think is going to feel really good about themselves, is going to feel like they're really on the right track. But one of us is going to lose, and whoever loses this game is not going to feel nearly as great about their situation. And it's the reality of college football in week 2. It's, every game feels like life or death. So I've been stressed since Tuesday on this one. I'm sure y'all have been the same way.
I've been feeling the same way.
Hey, Robert,
you get a game like this circled on your calendar, like you mentioned. When it's circled on your calendar for that long, the buildup does happen, and you start getting like, okay, am I thinking right here? Am I double thinking this? Am I triple thinking this? And I think that's where I've gotten to the stage on some of these things where I've even started to ask myself questions. I'm at that point pretty much.
Hey, Robert, where do you think Texas A&M has improved, this upcoming year? First thing that comes to my mind is their offense. I think they have Connor Weigman. He's a much better quarterback you have under center. Your wide receiver core, I always mispronounce his name, number 0, Anais Smith, very good receiver. But you have 2 other studs as well who play very well against New Mexico. I mean, I think, in my opinion, you have one of the strongest receivers in the nation. So I'd love to hear, your thoughts overall about this team.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest place where we feel like you have the biggest opportunity to improve from last year definitely is the offense. Now, granted, part of that was because the offense was so anemic last year. A&M was outside the top 100 in scoring offense last year. It was pathetic. But this year they bring back every starter but one. They bring back everybody but Devon Achane, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with now, playing for the Dolphins. And a big part of that too is you bring in Bobby Petrino, so you're seeing a pretty big difference just in, I think, offensive philosophy and scheme, formations, tempo, that kind of thing. And you mentioned Connor Weigman. I think him coming into his second season, he was a 5-star recruit, part of that 2022 recruiting class, and a guy that everybody going into the season, he was one of those big what ifs. Is like, okay, if Weigman takes that second year jump, that can really raise the ceiling for this entire team. And based on what we saw last week, I mean, early returns are really promising. He threw for 5 touchdowns, threw for, I think 75% completion rate. So he kind of checked all the boxes in week 1 of what you wanted to see. And certainly when you have an offense that the most we scored in any game last year was 38 points, and they scored 35 in the first half against New Mexico. That definitely checks that box of like, okay, we feel like we're heading in the right direction here. And then I think defensively too, you can make the case that A&M should be just as good, if not better, than they were last year. They're bringing back 9 out of 11 starters on that side of the ball. You're in your second year under D coordinator D.J. Durkin, and especially on the front four, that A&M defensive line is just loaded with 4- and 5-star guys, and not just like in the starters. I'm talking like 2-3 deep of like top 100 recruits. So they're essentially the thing we've been saying all offseason. I mean, if you just look at the roster, there's no excuses. There's no reason this shouldn't be a really good team. And so we're kind of just hoping that all of those problems last year, everything that seemingly could go wrong did go wrong. You're hoping that this year you've got better experience just from the team as a whole. I think offensively you're bringing in a better scheme, and then just you kind of roll the dice with injury luck, and you hope that you don't have just the catastrophic injuries across the board. And I know y'all suffered a lot of that too last year. And you just hope that as much as last year was such a negative in so many aspects, that you can kind of come back around and you hope that some of that stuff just breaks right for you this time around, and that can lead to something big.
I'm curious, you mentioned, a lot of starters coming back there on the offense, A-Chain definitely being a name, that we're definitely aware of, very talented running back. Your personal stance, how do you feel about this running back core right now and the depth behind the starting running back?
Running back depth is the strength of that position. If anything, the question mark is who is the guy, because this is the first year in several years where we don't know we don't know exactly who that first guy is. I know Amari Daniels as a third-year player, that he's kind of been the guy that he's been getting kind of like he'll go out in the first play of the game. He did it last week. But we saw a lot of sophomore Le'Veon Moss. We saw a lot of true freshman Ruben Owens. And the expectation is that you'll kind of see equal shares of all three of those guys. And then at some point over the course of the season, you hope, I mean, not you hope, but you assume at some point one of those guys kind of rises to the top and takes that lead back role. And at receiver, I know you mentioned that earlier. And I would agree with you that I would say A&M has sneakily one of the best units in the country. And also we probably had it last year. We just couldn't have the offense to get the ball in the guys' hands. But yeah, you mentioned Anaya Smith. You've got the two sophomores in Evan Stewart and Noah Thomas, who both were just electric and pretty much unguardable against New Mexico. And then you throw into that Moose Muhammad, who is the son of Moose Muhammad, the former NFL receiver. Mm-hmm. And another guy that probably isn't on a lot of non-Aggies radar, but got a transfer named Jay Walker, I think, from Grand Valley State. Mm-hmm. So wasn't like a really hyped up transfer, but he's been a guy, like, all he's done is make plays all through camp, and he was in that receiver rotation as well in week one. He had 2 or 3 catches. So it's a position where, if anything, depth is the concern, because you've got a great top 5, and then outside of those top 5 guys, it can get dicey real quick. But just strictly from like that very top starting lineup of receivers, it's hard to, there are certainly other great receiver groups out there. You've got Ohio State, you've got Texas. I'm sure there's others I'm missing. But I would put A&M's up there with just about anybody.
And, mentioning the run game, we were talking about earlier here, of course, that goes hand in hand with it. How did you feel went for the offensive line?
Offensive line, certainly a step up from what we saw a year ago, and that was expected because you're bringing back everyone who started last year. So you certainly hope that you're going to see some improvement from those guys. Pass protection in particular, in week one, I think looked really solid. A&M, they were not dominant running the ball. They ended up, I think, at like 4.8 yards per carry. But a lot of that was, I think, a symptom of New Mexico essentially just loaded the box and told A&M, hey, like, if you're going to beat us, you're going to beat us by throwing it over the top. And that's why you saw Connor Wigman have 5 touchdown passes, because I think A&M, they tried to kind of, force feed the run just to get it working. But New Mexico basically said, we're just going to put 7 guys in the box and we don't care what happens. And they paid the price for that. But it'll be interesting to see what happens this week, because I don't think Miami will take that same stance. And so it's going to be a nice little chess match of how that's going to evolve and how the offense may look different this week compared to what we saw a week ago.
Robert, where do you think Texas A&M has the edge over Miami? I'm not sure if you've seen Miami play yet or seen their film against Miami, Ohio, but where do you think Texas A&M has the edge in this game?
Yes, I'm not going to claim to be a Miami expert. I did watch at least like a condensed version of the y'all's game last week just to try to get a feel for it. If I had to guess, I would probably say maybe like our offensive line versus Miami's defensive line. But I think like where the real interesting matchup is going to be is A&M's defensive line, which I feel like is probably our strength, versus Miami's new offensive line, which I know is really retooled and something you guys are really excited about. So it's one of those where that's like a seeming strength for both teams. So whoever can actually win the day and get the advantage there, I think that's going to go a long way in determining how this game plays out.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting matchup. Vegas has the spread going. I think it started off at 7 points, then 5, now 4, keeps getting smaller. So it seems like they're not sure about this game either, how it's going to pan out. Neither am I, to be honest. I do think Miami's secondary is going to be tested heavily against Texas A&M's offense because I think it's very good. And I think you made a great point. I wasn't impressed with Texas A&M's run game with their personnel. Offensively with Miami, they do have a strong run game where I think that's going to give Miami the edge if they want to win this football game. Where do you think Miami can take advantage of probably a weakness Texas A&M has in this game if they want to win?
I will say our secondary did not look as dominant as I would have liked them to have looked. Like they weren't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it was one of those where it's like there were plenty of plays where the guy was right there. Like it wasn't necessarily a blown coverage or anything, but they were allowing completions, and it was like short stuff. It wasn't they were losing guys down the field, but once again it was New Mexico, and so you really hope that that's going to be locked down, like you're not having any issues guarding those receivers. So yeah, it's like it'll be interesting because as you mentioned, I think Miami's strength is definitely seemed like it was running the ball. But just like I talked about with A&M, I'm not so sure that we're just going to see a carbon copy of that again this week because maybe like they ran the ball so dominantly because look, like that Miami of Ohio defensive line, they looked on the smaller side. So I'm sure that your offensive line had no issue just kind of manhandling those guys. They got like a 4 or 5 yard push seemingly every play. So Miami may go into this game saying we're not going to lean on the run as much. And I think A&M secondary it's not vulnerable, but if I am picking kind of a weak spot, I think that might be it for me.
Kind of curious, just for our fans who might not have seen some of the film so far or have seen some of the pre, what kind of defensive scheme can they expect to see from Texas A&M on the field this upcoming game?
So Durkin runs primarily a 4-2-5.
Yep.
So, and actually that was a kind of nightmare for a lot of A&M fans last year. Was early on in the season, partially because of injuries, but he ran a ton of like 3-man fronts, more of like a 3-3-5, and it didn't work, and we all hated it. But it looks like this year back to more of like the straight 4-2-5. Doesn't blitz just a whole bunch. They try to just get pressure with their front four. But certainly they're open. Like they will occasionally blitz a linebacker, blitz a corner. But I would say overall not super duper aggressive. Granted, I'm not the biggest X's and O's guy either, so there might be other Aggies that would say I'm wrong on that one.
We got a question, Robert, from Mr. HD. How do you feel about Miami's stud tight end room? I don't know if they're stud tight end, but they do have a lot of depth against your freshman linebacker. Our offensive coordinator, Shannon Dawson. Mr. HD says that will be an edge in this game.
I'll be honest, I don't know anything about Miami's tight end room. That's not meant as a slight. That's just me not knowing that roster maybe as well, obviously as well as you guys do. But that absolutely could be, because A&M is starting a true freshman at linebacker in Torian York, and that was a surprise. That was because he was like a 3-star recruit. He was one of the last guys we signed before early signing day, kind of a late offer. So for him to, like, he came in the spring, and for him to earn the starting job over like some like 3rd, 4th year players, it's kind of one of those good news, bad news, where you're always nervous about starting a freshman, but you look at the experienced guys that he beat out, and you at least hope, you're like, okay, well, if he beat those guys out, it's because he's doing something right. But you can do all the things right in camp and in practice, but when the bright lights turn on,
Right.
Especially for a true freshman, his first time in a real major matchup like this, you never know how it's going to turn out.
What are your expectations with Bobby Petrino as your new offensive coordinator? Are you expecting? Here's a better question. Do you think he hasn't really opened up the offense? There's a lot more to see against Miami.
I would say that's fair to say, because from what it looked like, they didn't run anything that was too complex last week, mainly because, you saw, like, with those receivers, they were pretty much playing man coverage the whole time, and A&M knew, it was like, okay, if they're playing man coverage on our guys, like, it's game over. Like, we can just straight up just out-talent them, and that's all we need to do. And I'm sure Miami was the same way, is that, we're going to see a lot of wrinkles, a lot of formations and shifts and plays this week that we didn't see last week. But yeah, the very good news for A&M fans, though, is that one of the big narratives all offseason was people questioning, was Petrino actually going to call plays? Was this even going to be a different offense, or was this just kind of, them hiring somebody just to score PR points? And if you watch that offense last week, that was a different offense for sure. Just I think the aggressiveness in the downfield passing game was something we never saw under Jimbo. You didn't see a whole lot of like movement and shifts in this game, but once again, it was game one where you're trying to keep things kind of vanilla. But one of the biggest and the most noticeable things for an A&M fan was just the tempo change. And it's not like super duper up tempo. It's not like hurry up, no huddle. But with Jimbo, the calling card was that he would bleed the clock down to like 5 seconds on the play clock every single play. And it was, it was just like, it would drag it out, and it just felt like it killed any like momentum the offense had. Whereas I think last week I saw, on average, A&M snap the ball with like 16 seconds left on the clock, and they hardly ever let it get below 10. So it was much more of a like kind of actually, it felt like you were in the flow of an offense instead of just like having one play and then everyone stand around and look at the sidelines for 30 seconds. And so essentially, any of the narratives that this was going to just be the same old A&M offense is not true. Now, it's like, that doesn't mean it's going to be a top 10 offense, and I don't think most of us are expecting that. But if you can get into the top 30 offenses with what we hope is going to be a good defense, all of a sudden you can have a really good team. And so that's, I think, what most A&M fans are hoping for, is get from not just awful to average, but hopefully awful to good.
Speaking directly about that, then, how big of a game, this is kind of a two-part question for you. How big of a game is this for Jimbo? Of course, being the former Florida State coach and having that old rivalry with Miami, and then piling on top of, how big of a season is it, in your opinion, for Jimbo Fisher?
I mean, and this may be hyperbole, but I would say that for this season overall, this is almost like a legacy-defining season for Jimbo.
Okay.
Because obviously he won the national title at Florida State, had a lot of success there, and seemed like he had things kind of on the right track at A&M until last season happened. And so all of a sudden you go 5-7. And so now all of a sudden it's like, okay, is he going to be a guy that he came here, he got the big contract, and then he flamed out, and then we never saw him as a big time college football coach again? Or if he can turn things around and if he can get this program headed in the right direction, the reality still exists where Jimbo turns this around, goes on to massive success at A&M, takes advantage of all the recruiting, all the resources, and by the end of his career, people think of him more as an A&M coach than they did for what he did at FSU. And so this year's the start of that for sure. And this game in particular, I think, is it's the first pivot point on that path, I would say, because while you can sit there and rationalize, and I've done it myself, that it's a non-conference game, so you could lose this game and you could still go on to improve and you can still have a good season. You can win a bunch of games in the SEC. But at the same time, we're at this part of the year where all of us are still trying to figure out exactly what our team really is, like who's good and who's not. And so this is one of those games where if you want to have a defining bounce back season, you want to be able to point to this game and say yeah, that's where it started, where this is our first big test. We conquered that one, and then we moved on to the next one and the next one and the next one, as opposed to this just being yet another bump in the road.
Robert, let's say Jimbo Fisher loses to Miami. Is he on the hot seat?
And I wouldn't say right away. I think, certainly you let the season play out, you see what happens. But now it's if you tell me if that leads to he goes 7-5, he goes 6-6, I would say absolutely. And that's even with a $7 million buyout or something like that. Because A&M is a place where it's obviously we don't have a championship pedigree. We don't have a whole bunch of crystal football sitting in our locker room, but A&M gives you all the ingredients to be a great football program. A&M has the money from an NIL standpoint. A&M has the facilities investment. They're in the SEC. You're in a recruiting hotbed in Texas where, if you're doing things the right way, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to bring in a really talented roster and win a bunch of games. And so as much as that buyout is an insane amount of money, I think you get to see A&M boosters sit there and say, we would do more damage to the program long term if we keep someone around who's not the guy, who everyone knows is not the guy. Because the worst thing you could do is have a lame duck head coach where, no one's going to sign up to play for him because they know he's not going to be there for much longer. And so I think you'd have to kind of pull that ripcord and do it. So for that reason alone, I think we're all really hoping that we don't have to cross that road.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be an interesting season for Texas A&M and Miami. Like I said, this is going to be a huge game for both programs. I don't know what's going to happen. I'll give you my prediction a little bit, but I think there's a lot of encouragement, a lot of excitement from both fan bases going into this game for different reasons, obviously. Ross, anything you have for Robert before we kick it over for his prediction?
Wanted to get kind of an outsider's opinion here because, we're talking about Jimbo Fisher and what his situation is. And an outsider's opinion here who's not a Canes fan. What do you see in Mario Cristobal? And if Mario Cristobal, let's say, doesn't have the type of season that he should have, we're tied into him long term. How should Canes fans be feeling? Should we be feeling that the process is still just the process and wait, or do you think Cristobal is the type of guy who's going to start to really show us the process in year two?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, especially in year two, as much as today, with the transfer portal, and we've seen teams do it. And we all saw Colorado beat TCU last week. It's easier than ever to achieve instant results. But for me, I still like to try to preach patience because, as you guys have seen, it seems like he really has kind of reinvigorated the program. Recruiting has taken off, to levels we haven't seen in I couldn't even tell you how long. So for me, I always say you wait until like you definitively know. And I'm not sure, barring just like a complete disaster, like it's really hard to know in year 2
Yeah.
whether or not he's going to be the guy. Um, but I mean, but yeah, Miami's very similar to A&M in that regard, though. That it's in a place where it's like it's not hard to recruit kids to come play for the U. And I know you guys are like in the process. I think y'all are doing a new practice facility. I've seen renderings of potentially an on-campus stadium down the road. So they're kind of checking all the right boxes of like we're here to be serious about college football. And it seems like Cristobal is a part of that. So
Yeah.
I mean, I'm obviously outside of this game on Saturday. I mean, I'm hopeful you guys turn it around. I'm hopeful that they all have a great season because if nothing else, win or lose for A&M, y'all being good makes us look good.
Yeah.
And plus, I feel like Miami is just one of those teams that college football is more fun when Miami is really good because it just it makes it like those games against FSU or games against Florida when y'all play them. It ups the ante for so many other programs around the country as well. So here's hoping that happens.
Yes, absolutely. And we're excited about the investment into the football program. And we're excited that, a guy like you from Texas A&M is even noticing that we're putting that kind of money forth and that kind of effort forth into our program. So that kind of gives me a feeling of, hey, we're making a little noise maybe over here. Finally, it's been a while. We've been kind of pretty mediocre, ups and downs. But I'd like to think that Mario Cristobal is making not just noise, but the right kind of noise. There's noise that can be made and it's just purposeless. I think Cristobal is preaching the right thing. And I feel like we got a guy that I'm trusting the process myself, honestly, is what I'm pretty much getting to. Year 3, year 4 is when I really expect to start to see things change a lot. This year 2 is, to me, is almost the transitional period because of the discoveries we made in year 1 and the issues we had in year 1, and getting rid of those issues right away was what I thought was genius. I mean, like you said, no, just rip it off. No point in lingering. No point in letting bad coaches linger around or just systems that don't fit linger around. So I'm very, very glad that Cristobal and the staff made those moves going forward. And I've definitely got hope for this future of Miami, man. We're finally, like I said, making that right noise, I think.
Yeah. And one thing you touch on there is, with having like those 2 new coordinators this year, it makes it to where obviously just from a program culture building standpoint, we're in year 2, but from a scheme standpoint, it almost puts you back in year 1. So I would say all the more reason to preach patience because, there are tons of great coordinators out there who went on to be really successful that year 1 wasn't their best year for their side of the ball. So even if, you see some growing pains, I think that's not necessarily an indictment that things aren't going to change.
Well, Robert, we're going to find out a lot Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC. What's your prediction, Robert? Texas A&M comes to a Hard Rock Stadium to take on the Miami Hurricanes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've seen the wall behind me, but I'm kind of an A&M fan, so I am going to predict an A&M win. I think originally my prediction I put out there was I said 31-24. I've kind of ticked that down. I'm thinking now more like 27-21 or 27-20, just because I feel like both defenses actually looked really good last week, and so I think both, whether it's turnovers or whatever, I think both offenses may have a little bit more trouble than we're all anticipating moving the ball on Saturday. But if nothing else, just for my own sanity, rooting for an A&M win, so I'm just going to try to will it into existence.
Hey, yeah, we'll see what happens. I have 31-28 going to the Canes. That's not going with my gut. I can see Texas A&M really take control of this game, win by 17. If they test our secondary, they win that battle with the pass game. I'm very high on their wide receiver core. This could be a long night for Miami. But if Miami's secondary gets a couple interceptions, we score points off of turnovers, our run game really develops, I think Miami has a shot in this game. Ross?
I'm going to kind of stick with my feelings that I had on our previous show about I don't think Miami is going to quite pull this one out this year, but I'm changing my score on it, though, after reviewing more film. I believe the score will be 23-30 in favor of Texas A&M. But like I mentioned before, this is a game that Miami can absolutely win. And if Miami comes out and runs the ball well and they play Miami-style football that they want to play, this is a game that they can win.
All right. Well, hey, that's why they play the game. We just give our predictions, and we'll be tuning in Saturday afternoon. Robert, thanks again, man, for just joining us and hopping on the scoop. We greatly appreciate your time today, and best of luck come Saturday.
Absolutely, guys. Same to you. Hope I hope you don't have too much luck, but great talking to you guys.
All righty. Take care, everyone, and always all about the U. Go Canes.